Jess is, I think she's one of the most recognised, most respected thinkers on gendered violence. In addition to her broadcast work, which you may have seen on SBS, you may have read in the quarterly essay, she's spoken at over 350 events, such as this one, has received multiple awards. I simply cannot rattle all of them off. Just a few. In 2023, she was Marie Claire's Changemaker of the Year, and just this year was awarded the New South Wales Premier's Woman of Excellence Prize. Please welcome to the stage, Jess Hill. It's so good to see you. It's so nice to see you.
Hello, everyone. Am I on? Is this thing on? It is on. Well, there's my daughter. That's not what I was hoping to see, although I am hoping to see her soon. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and to say that we owe our deepest gratitude to Aboriginal people and the way that they have cared for communities, lands and waters for the last 60,000 plus years, as far as we can count. I have fewer happy endings, I'm afraid, in the most literal sense. And I do say that unfortunately or fortunately, over the past decade, I've become a walking trigger warning, because if I walk into the room, most people know what I'm about to speak about. And what I want to talk to you about today is broadly about coercive control and family, domestic and sexual violence, but also about politics and about how we do change. And sometimes, as Grace said, it's the smaller changes that add up to the bigger change, and other times it's the people in pivotal positions that do it. But during all of this work that I've been doing with so many incredible people over the past 10 years or so, I guess what I'm always really cognizant of is that when my ancestors and the ancestors of many of yours arrived on the tall ships 240 years ago, we brought some really wicked social problems with us. Child abuse, family violence, gender inequality, misogyny, coercive control. We imported all of these like invasive pests. And so I think it's on all of us to help repair that damage and to give back that right to self-determination to First Nations people, because we have to create a better future for our children, and we owe that particularly to First Nations children, because justice and self-determination should be inalienable rights. And if we are going to make any real progress in this country, we must finally tell the truth about our violent past and our violent present. And we must make visible the systems of discrimination, racism and power and control, and use all of our ingenuity and willpower to fix them. So that's part of what I'm here to talk to you about today, but also that I spend most of my days really obsessing over how to solve all the world's problems, like we all do, but specifically, how do we best respond to coercive control and family and sexual violence? And sometimes that means grinding along and marching furiously against political brick walls. Special hello to the Morrison and Abbott governments, good times. And then sometimes the gates between the possible and the impossible just seems to swing open. You get a change of government, a ministerial reshuffle, or a few star players in all the right positions of power. And that's when you see magic happening. And by magic, I mean meaningful reform. The kind of reform that can actually change Australia. So what does that even look like? If you would like to take a brief stroll with me down memory lane, turning our minds back a few years to 2017, it had been a couple of years since Malcolm Turnbull had ousted Tony Abbott, who you may remember as our former Minister for Women. And he left such a legacy. And And for a few years, we had not only a self-avowed feminist prime minister imposing bonk bans on the federal parliament, but also one who gave 2 unlikely portfolios to an unashamed Liberal Party feminist, Kelly O'Dwyer. So she became the Minister both for Women and the Minister for Finance. Now, back in December of 2017, I don't know if you can remember that far back. I struggle some days, but the world was still reeling from the Me Too movement, which had gone viral about 2 months earlier. And literally, right up until Christmas and well into 2018, one's morning routine consisted of waking up, getting a coffee, and then catching up on which of your artistic heroes had been exposed as a sexual deviant overnight. But more than that, as the feminist journalist Christina Ziwica wrote at the time, the protective cladding of power and privilege that had long silenced victims and shielded powerful perpetrators had been pierced. You could hear the alarm bells in Hollywood and around the world. Beep, beep, rape culture systems are down. So this was like a rare moment of structural weakness in patriarchy, where you had this vulnerable piece of flesh that had been exposed. And it was like women all over the world had just received this subliminal message that now was the time to draw back their arrows and shoot. And so O'Dwyer didn't waste time, or as we would say in our delightful Australian vernacular, she was not in Canberra to fuck spiders. So long story cut short, she was determined to actually do something meaningful to improve women's economic security. So she supported the ambitious and visionary Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins to produce the radical, paradigm-shifting Respect at Work report. 55 recommendations to thoroughly transform working culture in Australia, including a whopper, a positive duty for workplaces to prevent sexual harassment, which would put sexual harassment on the same footing as workplace injury. Now, of course, by the time Respect at Work was finished, Turnbull was out, and so Jenkins handed it to Christian Porter, who you'll no doubt be shocked to hear shelved it for a year. Back to the grind. But despite the coalition refusing to introduce a positive duty, Jenkins kept at it. She was speaking on webinars for anyone who would host them, biding her time, playing that long game. And then after 2021, when the chickens really came home to roost for the coalition and women marched furiously across the country, I'm sure a number of you were among them, the headwind of angry and determined women was behind the Albanese government, and they made an election promise to adopt all 55 recommendations, including the positive duty. So now we have world-leading reform that obligates workplaces to prevent sexual harassment from occurring. And the lawyer Josh Bornstein, who has a particular turn of phrase and a very long experience on working on sexual harassment cases, he told me the positive duty obligation is worth 1 million bystander sessions because it actually requires the organisation to root and branch consider how to minimise the sexual harassment occurring, which means looking at the profile of the workforce, the gender composition, wage differences, the whole lot. And the workplaces that would most need to change, and he pointed this out with some relish, was what Jenkins categorised as the most high-risk ones, where you have men in their 50s and 60s dominating at the top and women in their 20s and 30s down the bottom. And by the way, combining those two portfolios, women and finance, is an absolute dead set winner, and globally it is very unusual. And as many of you probably know, Katie Gallagher now holds these dual portfolios. And as a result, we've seen powerful changes adopted from her Women's Economic Equality Task Force, like the abolition of the Punitive Parents Next program and the restoration of the single parenting payment to single parents with children aged up to 14, which came back from single parents with children aged up to 8, which had been put through by Howard and Gillard. So I wanted to go on that little stroll just to remind us that even in times that feel hopeless and heavy, and when it feels like, oh, nothing is being done, you know, why aren't we seeing action, that there can be seismic changes afoot that are happening just out of sight. And I don't know if you've felt it. Anyone I think who was watching the news in the past few months would have felt the fact that gate of possibility swung open again. But horribly, in the area of domestic and family violence, that gate swings open on the hinge of horrific domestic homicides. Or in the case of this year, just a seemingly relentless run of them. And for anyone who's engaged in public-facing work in this, it's really the worst part of the work, because you're at your busiest following a murder or the annihilation of an entire family, because the public is aghast and the media needs accountability and answers. And honestly, when I get those phone calls, most of the time I just feel like curling up under my doona and hiding, because when the public is horrified, so am I, and so are all the people who work in this sector. But you can't help feeling in those moments that this is a person we failed. But we also know that you need to harness those moments of shock and grief and anger as teachable moments, because it is the time that the public and politicians are listening. But even there, it's such a difficult balance, because often you have really few details about a specific case, and you have to balance what you should say in terms of what the teachable moment is with what is relevant and right for that person who has just been murdered and their surviving family and friends. And I think the murders of Luke and Jessie were perfect exemplary of that, which was that suddenly there was an opportunity to speak about domestic and family violence in LGBTQI relationships, but their alleged murderer was not in a typical relationship with Jessie. He was a stalker who was also a police officer, primarily. So even though there's an opportunity to speak about that, it's not necessarily right to frame it that way, because it's a betrayal of what that story is actually about. So it's very difficult to balance. And over the past 15 years or so, we've seen so many of these big media moments come and go, and sometimes they usher in huge change and sometimes they don't. But there is something different about this moment, and there's something different about the momentum and the determination from journalists to keep it going, and a federal government that has committed to ending gendered violence in a generation. Federal and state and territory governments all made that commitment. Now, I used to scoff at that, and I think I have described it as destroying language, because it's actually just completely unachievable. But now I leverage it, because, end it in a single generation, you say. Well, you'd be wanting to make some pretty significant changes and some pretty big funding commitments to do that, right? Because in areas that we're going towards zero, like ending emissions, for example, and other areas that we're saying we need to completely turn around, these are significant funding areas that are taken very seriously. So yes, absolutely, let us end gendered violence in a single generation. Great idea. Now, the federal government did not give additional funding to frontline services in the budget, and that travesty must be corrected next May, or potentially earlier. But they are committed to investing money and manpower into finding a way out of the stalemate that we're in. And they actually do want to tackle this problem. And I can tell you from my interactions with government, it is a very different experience to working with the previous Morrison government. God bless. And one area that the government does want to shake up is the way that we define and resource prevention work. So at the heart of our gendered violence prevention strategy at the moment is a population-wide project to improve gender equality, improve community attitudes, and address harmful gender norms, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to eradicate domestic abuse and sexual violence. We need to change community attitudes. We need to see those attitudes then correlate with changes to behaviour and perpetration. So this means everything from confronting and overturning the prejudices that underpin gender inequality, teaching kids what respectful relationships look like, and doing so in a way that actually connects with the most resistant of them. And also things like confronting bullying at school. Australia recently ranked #2 in the world for the worst bullying. A lot of that is underpinning victimisation and perpetration later in life. But long-term community attitude change is a strategy that could take decades to yield results. And in the meantime, we have abusers remaining largely out of sight, running systematic campaigns of degradation and terror, and committing acts that so far this year are escalating to murder every 4 days. So I feel an incredible sense of urgency about this because victim survivors across Australia who regularly email, call and speak to me at events like these, they do not have time to wait. So for the past 5 years, I've toured Australia speaking on coercive control at many hundreds of events, as Jan mentioned. And at those events, I'm talking to communities, frontline workers, health workers, magistrates, lawyers. I've listened to their fears and frustrations in mostly regional areas, Darwin, Geelong, Wagga, Shepparton, the Illawarra, Coffs Harbour, and that's just a few that I've done this year. And the frontline workers just consistently say sexual violence and coercive control cases are becoming more complex and more severe. They're clear about the connections between intergenerational trauma and how they're seeing the children that they may have worked with 20 or 30 years ago re-emerging as perpetrators and victims who are re-engaging with their services. They're clear about the connections between harmful, largely unregulated industries like mainstream porn and gambling and alcohol, and they are desperate for more resources to work with kids. Victim survivors also are just at their wits' end. They're trying to restart their lives, find housing, help their kids heal from the trauma that was inflicted by the perpetrator, even as he continues to torment, stalk and dominate them through systems like child support and the family law courts. And they wonder, how on earth can I prevent my kids becoming victims or perpetrators themselves? But what can they do? Support for children survivors is inadequate, and that is especially in regional areas, but that is everywhere across Australia. And the most desperate of those are caught up in the family law system, and they are ordered to hand their children over to a parent they know to be dangerous. So I get several emails a day from people in these desperate and complex circumstances. And I just wonder why we still have systems so unsuited to protecting women and children from dangerously fixated men that many feel they have no choice but to stay or to go back to them. And that's 6 times on average before they often leave for good. But it doesn't have to be this way, and I am an eternal optimist. And when we talk about prevention, we need to be talking really broadly about this. So not predominantly just about having better conversations with boys, although that's really necessary. This admirable project to try to stop it before it starts and really doing this population-wide approach. But also about how can we stop someone who is already being violent from being violent again and to the next partner and the next partner? How do we hold people who use coercive control and family violence accountable? What loopholes do we need to close and what practices do we need to transform to stop perpetrators weaponising systems like Centrelink, child support and the family law courts to continue their abuse and control? Why aren't we pouring everything we have into preventing child maltreatment and helping children who've experienced it to recover? How can we help victim parents and their kids recover from coercive control and family violence so those kids don't grow up to become perpetrators themselves? How can we regulate harmful industries like alcohol, gambling, mainstream porn and social media? In our current prevention approach, the private sector is predominantly engaged in terms of education and training to create safe and respectful workplaces. And that's really important, as I've mentioned, but there is very little mention of business models that are actually causing or exacerbating gendered violence. And worse, they're actually monetizing it. They make money out of being unregulated and unfettered. And that's particularly for social media and for online pornography. So we need to get serious about the impact of certain industries, particularly gambling and alcohol, on the severity and impact of perpetration, because we know that calls to domestic violence helplines spike during football grand finals. So how are we seeking to address the toxic nexus between sport, alcohol and problem gambling? And last but not least, How can we make meaningful structural changes to achieve greater gender equality, which will lead to meaningful cultural change, just like Kate Jenkins and Kelly O'Dwyer did with Respect at Work? And I know I am now over time. I would just add that I will skip many parts of this, but I want to just add that crisis response, which has so often been seen poorly as the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, that is also prevention. And it's one of the first places victim parents and their kids have a safe place to breathe and to imagine a better future. And it can be a place that kickstarts the beginning of recovery and would have much better results if we could actually stop perpetrators exploiting systems to torment, dominate, and exploit their victims post-separation. So what we need to see, and what government and policymakers need to see, is that women's refuges aren't just warehousing women and kids who should be allowed to stay home. Refuges are actively preventing homicide, they are preventing suicides, and the decision by state and federal governments for the past few decades to systematically underfund the refuge system and provide short-term grants to the people who run them undermines the sector's ability to do this acute homicide and suicide prevention work. And I think that the one example I would give as just the insanity of our current approach is that women 10 years ago had more chance of getting protection and support than they do today. So back in 2014, I was told around half of the women and kids seeking refuge had to be housed temporarily in motels until a refuge bed became available. The average stay for them was about 5 nights, which was up from about 1 night 5 years earlier. And there are around 50 women and kids who are being accommodated in motels across Victoria every night. 10 years later, the average stay for women and kids is 14 nights. And now there are up to 350 women and kids in motels across Victoria every night. Now, we can't find those equivalent stats for New South Wales, but what we know is that the Safe Steps Family Violence Helpline, which deals with around 350 calls per day, they get 70% of the people registering a serious risk requiring immediate protection. 52% of their clients have active suicidality. Now, 7% of those will end up in refuge, but by 9 a.m. the refuge beds are full. So 93% of those callers in that category, they go into motels with their kids where they sit and they wait and they angst and they wonder if they're going to be found by the surveillance app that they fear is on their phone or in their car. 90% of these clients have been strangled. A third of them are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. 13% are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. 20% have a disability. There's a model in Victoria called Sanctuary, which literally puts women who are waiting for refuge into a holding space that has access to financial counselling, access to education, access to caseworkers, police to support intervention orders, immigration services, teachers for the kids, music and play therapists, a maternal health nurse, even a bloody therapy dog. And when these women and kids leave Sanctuary to go into refuge, they leave with an assured income through Centrelink, safe separation in terms of Medicare and other government services, visa issues in the process of being resolved, legal proceedings underway, intervention orders in place. And all of that is cheaper per night than putting them into a motel. And literally we had 3 suicides in Victoria of women who were waiting in motels for refuge. This is like the most low-hanging of low-hanging fruit. And if government doesn't know how to just put money and resources into this system to prevent homicide and suicide, then it is not serious about ending violence in a single generation. So to finish, I would just say that we face such enormous complexity in responding to domestic abuse and child safety, and the solutions are often not obvious. It can feel like we are looking for some silver bullet, but there's courageous and dedicated people around the country who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible. They're getting remarkable results. And if we were to really become serious about ending domestic abuse and devoting the funding and resources necessary to do that, I think the results would be spectacular. And I think it would be one of the greatest nation-building exercises in Australia's history. Thank you.